Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the South Georgetown Boundary Study. This is our public consultation meeting, and we are coming to you tonight via live stream. We do have a variety of committee members on this call, and you'll get an opportunity to meet them. So Fred, if I could have the next slide, please. As always, here in the Halton District School Board, we do take a moment each time to honor the land and territory. So Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us. And at this time, I would like to invite our Associate Director of Education, Tina Salmini, to say a few words and welcome us all. Tina?
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to this public consultation meeting on behalf of the Director's Office. Thank you so much for making the time to learn about the process and the preferred options for this boundary review. Your thoughts and opinions enhance the process greatly. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the members of the Boundary Review Committee for all of their work that has already been done and the work that will be undertaken in the coming weeks. This is really significant work within our system, and so we are very, very grateful. The committee includes community members who are the school representatives, trustees, superintendents, planning department staff, and representatives from Halton Student Transportation Services. We have many great minds and perspectives on this committee to help us manage this review and lead us to a successful completion of the process. So you'll be introduced to these members a little later on. We hope that this evening is very informative for all of you and that you are able to share your feedback on the options as well as have your questions answered. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you very much, Associate Director Salmini. Really appreciate that welcome. In addition, we have the pleasure of having two of our trustees with us throughout this process. So I'd like to invite Halton Hills trustee, Jean Gray, and Oakville trustee, Carol Baxter, to share a welcome as well.
Well, thank you very much, Superintendent Fowler. And on the heels of Associate Director Salmini, I, along with Carol Baxter, would be very much echoing the sentiments of our Associate Director. We want to, both of us want to, as trustees in the Halton District School Board, we want to thank the parents in Georgetown South for their time and engagement in this process, and for all of the parents that are in attendance tonight for coming out to help us with this very important decision to be made. It's so important to have and hear the parents' voice, to generate ideas, to ask the hard questions, and to ensure that good decisions are being made on behalf of the many students in Georgetown South. So again, on behalf of Carol Baxter and myself, thank you so much for your attendance in tonight's very important community consultation meeting.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So now to General Manager Thibault, who's going to take us through the agenda. Before he begins, I just want to give a huge shout out and thanks to our planning department at the Halton District School Board for leading us through this process. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and just the quick response and organization has been very, very well taken care of all of us. So we really thank you for guiding us tonight as well. So over to you, General Manager.
Thanks, Jen. Again, thanks, Alex, for everyone that's in the community, as well as for the community tonight joining us to learn more about the process and to eventually provide their feedback and questions this evening. So in terms of our agenda tonight, we've got, I'd say, about three major parts we need to get through. The first one is an information presentation where we want to provide you a little bit of context on the background of the boundary review, why we're doing it. I want to introduce you to our boundary review committee and our steering committee as well, the backbone of the process that we're currently going through. Then I'm going to hand it off to a couple of our parent representatives to give a little bit or a few words on the process and their thoughts around it. Afterwards, we'll jump into providing you an overview of the options that have been shortlisted. We started with 5, and tonight we'll be providing you with 2 and information around that. And then we'll advise on next steps too. Afterwards, there'll be part 2 of this evening's presentation, which will be more staff responding to the questions that have been submitted in advance of the meeting. However, you'll also have an opportunity through the form that'll be available on screen through a QR code or on our board website for the Georgetown Boundary Review to submit additional questions, which we'll be curating and reviewing tonight and answering. We'll be dedicating about half an hour to that. And lastly, just to close off, we'll give you a quick note on what to do next and what to expect in the coming weeks. Jean?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Fred. I just want to be sure that everyone in the community that wishes to attend are able to join in. It looks like we are stuck at about 13 people right now. That seems to be just the members of our committee and staff. I just want to be ensured that folks are able to get into this meeting.
Oh, Jean, it's a live stream, much like our board meeting. Kevin, can you confirm that it's being viewed through our YouTube channel?
Thank you for that clarification, Fred.
All good. No, it's just for moderation and just to make it a little bit easier. But thanks for just clarifying that, Jean. Moving on to part 1. So we're just going to give you a little bit of an overview in the background of the boundary review process itself. In December of 2022, we had a board meeting and trustees approved and directed staff to initiate a boundary review process for South Georgetown. So this would involve both Silver Creek and Ethel Gardner. The resolution was read as, be it resolved that the Halton District School Board directs staff to complete a boundary review for ERA, or Elementary Review Area 124, South Georgetown, with the objective of addressing accommodation pressures. So the purpose of the boundary review really is to attenuate a lot of the pressures that we've been feeling at Ethel Gardner. This has been compounded with both a lot of growth happening within the community, as well as the programming needs of the school and just the overall growth in the community. So with that, we were directed to find a solution to reduce that pressure overall. Something else I'd like to note is that as part of this process and through implementation, we may be considering of doing a mid-year implementation once the results are in as to what the ultimate boundaries are, and this would affect any new registrants. So we're trying to mitigate any further impact on somebody that's moving into the community for the first time. So that'll be some more work that we'll be doing with the committee at a later time. Now, with regards to the study area, which for the purpose of this review is comprised of both the Silver Creek and the Ethel Gardner English track boundaries, both schools have very different overall utilizations in that how many students are occupying the school versus the size of the school. At the moment, Ethel Gardner is currently at 121% utilization, so there's a significant amount of pressure at that school. And in contrast, Silver Creek is at 67% of its overall utilization. So there's an opportunity there to balance out enrollment. In terms of programs, both of these schools are the only facilities in Halton Hills that offer a JK to 8 program. So they both have K to 8 English, as well as a number of special education programs. So Ethel Gardner has grade 5 to 8 gifted, as well as some LD and behavioral classrooms for under the special education program, whereas Silver Creek has also learning disability and life skills programs. Now, there's a higher concentration in these schools because they're the only schools offering JK to 8. We can't offer those programs in JK to 5 schools. And what that results in is that the schools are filling up a lot more because there's a higher program need in those facilities. So that's another reason behind having to undertake this review. With regards to the French immersion program, that's being offered at George Kennedy and Centennial Public Schools. So there is no discussion around the FI boundaries. Those will remain unchanged. We're focusing strictly on the English track boundaries for this review. The one thing I do want to address with the community, because this is something that's been an ongoing point in discussion throughout Halton Hills, and the question surrounds is what's the status of the Georgetown number 3 South school site that's located just near 10th line. And what I'll say is that at the moment, although the board has acquired and owns the site, so we retain that asset, we don't see this as an immediate priority. Right now, looking long term, there's not a real need to construct a new facility within this area, given the existing space we have available, both in South Georgetown and the remainder of Halton Hills. So with that, the next course of action or new schools that we may expect in Halton Hills will more than likely be within the Vision Georgetown area. So at the end, what I want to make clear is that this school site won't be the solution that we're going to have to address the enrollment issues that we're currently feeling at Ethel Gardner. We just don't have enough students to warrant the ministry to fund us a new school. So I just wanted to make that clear that this isn't something that's going to be available within the next 10 years or more. In terms of our current timeline, as Tina and Jen have pointed out, we've been working on this for a little bit of time now. So we had our first few meetings at the beginning of January. We met with both our steering committee and our boundary review committee. And now that we've selected a few options to present to the community, this is what we intend to do tonight. The next steps afterward will be to review all of the feedback that we've received this evening as a committee, and then that'll help us decide as to what recommendation is going to be brought forward to senior team to ultimately recommend to the Board of Trustees for approval on the final boundaries of the school and how we're going to implement it. We're hoping to bring this to board first on February 15th. That's when it's going to be presented for the first time. And then we'll go for final approval on March 1st. The notice will be provided to the community via Center Mail or School Messenger and on the website on February 6th after we've brought this forward to our senior team. And then once the decision is made, we will notify all affected communities of what's going to be implemented. As I alluded to earlier, in terms of communications platforms, we have a dedicated webpage, so I'd encourage you to visit the website in order to find information around the boundary review process in terms of meeting minutes, presentations, all the options we reviewed thus far, as well as any updates on what's happening. If there are any further questions, there's the dedicated email that you can send your inquiries to, and we'll respond accordingly. And then lastly, I'd say it'd be important for you to pay attention to any communications from the board directed towards you, because that's how we'll be communicating to you the results and the next steps of this boundary review process. Now with this, I'd like to introduce our members. So we've had a total of 4 school members that are school parent reps that joined us as part of this process. We had 2 from Ethel Gardner and 2 from Silver Creek. So starting with Ethel Gardner, we had Aditi and Kieran that joined us. And from Silver Creek, we had Jillian and Tui. We'll have both a couple of our reps give you a few words in a moment. I just want to go through the rest of the list here. And as we mentioned earlier, we had both Trustee Carol Baxter and Jennifer Fowler as our co-chairs. Trustee Jean Gray and Scott Podreberic were our co-chairs for the BRC, or the Boundary Review Steering Committee. From the Planning Department, we had Lorene Choi, Mitchell Gundy, myself, Frederick Tebow, and we have Michelle Dagwar also joining us tonight to assist. And from Halton Student Transportation Services, we had Andrew Capern that's assisted us with all things transportation matters. So again, I want to thank the committee and all the work that you've put in thus far. It's been greatly appreciated. So in terms of if anyone's wondering what the mandate of the committee is, the mandate is essentially to represent all student voices. So, and it's to work collaboratively as a group in order to provide feedback amongst themselves, as well as with our steering committee members, so we can develop better options that end up with a preferred recommendation that we want to bring forward to the board. So really, we're trying to look at this thing holistically so that we're providing the best solution for the entirety of the community, both for now and for future students to come. As I mentioned earlier, we had our 4 representatives, 2 from each school, and those were appointed by parent council and then brought forward to us, and they since joined the committee. So with that, I want to just hand the mic over to Kieran and Jillian just to give us a few words on their perspective on the process and just to extend their thoughts to our viewers and our community.
Thanks. I can go first. So my name's Kieran here, and I've been a parent at Ethel Gardner for almost 10 years now. I have two daughters in the school. One's in grade 6 and the other's in grade 8. And throughout their time at Ethel Gardner, I've been involved in many different volunteering capacities at the school. So I was given the opportunity to be a part of the Boundary Review Committee and to provide input from an Ethel Gardner school perspective, a parent perspective. I found the process to be very well thought out. It was very well organized, very well managed. Everyone on the committee was encouraged to share their perspectives and opinions throughout each step. And of course, the driving force behind the discussions was to reduce the capacity at Ethel Gardner, for example, the number of portables that we currently have on site, and to use some of the available capacity at Silver Creek while having minimal impact on our families. I think the committee worked very well together. I was very impressed with the process. And I think that's it. Jillian?
Thanks, Karen. So I'm Jillian Reevy. I have 3 kids at Silver Creek, and we've been there for 11 years now. My oldest graduated grade 8 last year and is at GDHS. I have one in grade 8 currently, and I have a young one in grade 4. Similar to Karen, I found everything very well laid out. They encouraged us to give our input and to discuss how we felt about the boundaries and to talk about why certain boundaries were in certain spots and what we were looking to do. I also like that we agreed on principles in the beginning, things such as not only decreasing the number of portables at Ethel Gardner, but looking at how do we maximize walkability for students and how do we minimize bus use. One of the things that was evident throughout the whole thing is that all members of this committee, they are problem solvers. They care about the communities at both schools, and we really care about the students, and that was very evident. For some of you, there might be a lot of uncertainty. There might be a lot of apprehension if you are in a boundary that might be moved from Ethel Gardner to Silver Creek. And as a member of our parent council at Silver Creek, we're actually very excited to have you come join us and be part of our community. And we realize how challenging this can be. And we're going to look to find a way to connect with you before September and to bring you in to get to know our family and hopefully ease the transition. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks, Jillian. We really do appreciate that, and we extend it too. So, the parent representatives were great in terms of sharing their ideas and bringing forward their own perspective, and really looking towards the benefit of all students in this process. So we do appreciate it, and it's been a pleasure working with you. And it's going to be a pleasure to continue working with you as we go through the process. All right. So with that, and Jillian had alluded to this earlier. In developing our options, we always look to trying to adhere to a set of criteria. We're trying to make sure that as we're reviewing them and we're weighing how options compare to one another, and as we develop them, we want to put a lens on how do we, to the best of our ability, try to adhere to all 8 of these criteria. Now, as was mentioned earlier, there's some criteria that we defined as being a little bit more prioritized or stronger, especially given the South Georgetown community. But with that, what I'll do is I'll just provide a quick explanation of each and what they mean. And the one thing I do want to leave here is that, in our development of the options, there's no one option that'll be perfect. There will always be one that, they could always do better in one specific criteria or another. But at the end of the day, it's the sum of its parts. So as long as the combined way of how it addresses each one of these criteria is successful, and it kind of outweighs another, that's what we're looking to do. Not perfection, but something that's good enough overall. To meet what our needs are for the specific community. So with regards to the 8, the first one is the viability of programs. So the big part about this is making sure that we're not creating a situation where the school is too large or too small in terms of enrollment. We have flexibility in the number of students that we have within the program. So it's things like we want to avoid triple splits or things like that. The size of the population is too small. Proximity to school, which was one that was very important in this committee, is we want to make sure that we're maximizing the opportunity for kids to walk, enroll to school. And If they can't walk and roll, then there's the option for transportation. But we want to make sure that the size of the community we're building is we're trying to make it as much of a walk-to neighborhood as possible. Stability was also a very important one. So make sure that whatever boundaries we do implement, they're ones that are good for the long term. We don't want to be coming here every 5 years or every few years just to address an issue. We just want to make sure that once we've done the work, we're moving on, and then the community can stabilize over the long term without having further disruptions. And that ties into as well student experience, which we'll get to in a few moments. The other piece is balancing enrollments, which ties very well to the use of portables. What we're trying to do here is we want to look at the size of our schools and the total enrollment we have, and where possible, we want to balance the enrollment. We want to make sure that we're creating an equitable distribution between the schools, so you don't have one school that's underutilized and one that's significantly overutilized, having a number of pressures. So we're trying to balance that out. And with that comes the trying to minimize the use of portables. Where there's the opportunity where we can have students within bricks and mortar, that's what we would prefer to do, as opposed to having one school that's half empty and one that has a number of students currently housed in portables. Transportation, we always want to be as effective as possible. We don't want to overuse transportation where we don't need to. So that's why, again, it ties to maximizing our opportunities for walking to school. And the other thing too is we just want to make sure we're providing the best services possible. So if we have too much of a reliance on transportation and not enough drivers or things like that, again, we can't provide the best service to our families and our students. Fiscal responsibility is one that ties to essentially all of these that have to do with space. We want to make sure that we're not spending too much on portables or spending too much on transportation or spending on, accommodating students in temporary facilities. And at the end of the day, what we want to do is make sure we're maximizing our expenditure in the classroom as opposed to other things that aren't related to learning and achievement. And the final criteria, but one of the most important ones, is the student experience. We want to make sure that as we're going through these processes and as we implement them, we're transitioning these students well into their new schools. And that, again, we want to minimize the amount of impacts that they have over the years. So that's why when we do a boundary review, we want to do it once. We want to make sure that community is as stable as possible for the long term, just for the benefit of the students. Now, I just want to go through a couple of the materials here so you're more familiar with how we've developed our options. One of the first exercises we did as part of the planning team was to develop the study area into distinctive zones. So what we look to do there is try to create some zones where we can move them around between boundaries while still having regard to the size and the shape of the community, what's walkable, who are people's neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. And we've further developed those zones as we've received feedback from our community, which initially we had 8 zones and we moved to 9 as we noticed that we could certainly enhance one of our zones. In the next few slides, we'll go through the options in the enrollment. So for this, I'll just present to you exactly how these charts are laid out. So as we read each chart, we have one for each school. The gray line represents the on-the-ground capacity. So that represents the size of the school in terms of how many students can fit within it, within bricks and mortar. So the built size of this facility. The red line represents the maximum portable capacity of that school. So that means depending on how many portables you can add, let's say if it's 10, that means we can add another 230 spaces to the facility. And these lines are meant to represent or indicators as to when we may expect to have portables or close to needing portables, or when we get to a point where we can no longer sustain that population at that facility. So if we pass the red line, we're typically in an issue, or if we get close to that red line, we're running into issues. The next piece of information we have on these charts are portable counts. So for each year, we provide the count of portables that we expect to have on site. We determine the number of portables by doing a staffing projection. So understanding what kind of programs there are, the number of students that are in each classroom, the loading of each classroom, and then reflecting that on what the actual usage of the school is. Because sometimes the OTG is not fully representative of how full the school can be. And then the color coordination essentially means anything below 75% of the total number of portables that can be used on site. If it's below that, it's green. If it's above 75%, it's orange. And if it's above the max capacity, in this case, it's 6 portables, then it's red, meaning that we have an issue in this option. Then we layer on the enrollment, which is represented in that green bar. And that just represents how much enrollment we're expecting year over year. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking to where we're either hitting or surpassing these capacities as indicators of where there may be some issues. Now with that, I'm just going to move on to a presentation on what our current enrollment forecasts are based on the boundaries that we presently have. And then we'll go through the two options that we have to present to the community tonight that were curated by our boundary review committee. So in terms of the two facilities, Ethel Gardner is a school of 614 pupil places. It has a maximum number of portables permitted on site of 10. Which increases its overall capacity at 844. In terms of programs, it has the English program, the Learning Disability program, Gifted, and Behavioral Classroom. Silver Creek is a building of 645 pupil places and has a maximum portable capacity of 12 for a total capacity of 921, and has the English Learning Disability and Life Skills program. So both of them have quite a bit of special education programs housed within those schools. In terms of transportation, this represents the transported area of both Silver Creek and Ethel Gardner. So the dashed blue and yellow line represents the walking boundary of Silver Creek. So anything beyond that are students that would be transported. And alternatively for Ethel Gardner, the dashed purple and yellow line represents the walking area of Ethel Gardner, and everything beyond that represents the transported area. So as you'll note here, both of these communities are very walkable. We have a very good coverage of area where kids can walk, and a quite low reliance on transportation overall. So this was certainly one of the big considerations we had as we developed our options, is how do we maximize that walking area and make sure that we're not impacting it. In terms of the status quo enrollment projections for Ethel Gardner, we were projecting a very long-term pressure at the school, whereas the facility would be having between 8 to 9 portables, peaking at 10 portables next year on site. So that certainly presented some issues in terms of the overall operations of a lot of the programs within that school facility. And there was always the risk of getting to the max or surpassing the max over time. So this was presented as an issue to us that we had to resolve. Alternatively, we have Silver Creek right now, which is projected to be around the mid 60% utilization. So there was a really good opportunity here to balance out that enrollment and utilize some of that on empty space that's currently at Silver Creek. So as I mentioned earlier, we had a total of 5 options that were reviewed by the committee. And for this evening, we've selected 2 to present to the community to receive feedback. So the first option I will be reviewing this evening is option number 2. So as I mentioned earlier, as I described these, I'll be describing them with regards to the zones and where those zones are going. So for option number 2, in this, what we were looking to do is relocate zones E and H, which were formerly zones that were at Ethel Gardner, and we would be directing those to Silver Creek. In terms of, and this is just a zooming of the area, so we have the new development area, and we have a portion of the more historic South Georgetown community, just north of that new development area in zone H and the north side of E. In terms of using or looking at the walkability and the amount of transportation required for this option, these students in the zones E and H were already being transported to Ethel Gardner. So in this case, they would remain bus students and would be transported over to Silver Creek. So where we'd see a reduction in busing at Ethel Gardner, we would just see it as an increase at Silver Creek. And in this option, we're not seeing any changes to the number of eligible students that can continue to walk to school for Ethel Gardner and Silver Creek. In terms of enrollment projections, almost immediately, Ethel Gardner drops by from 8 portables down to 3 portables. So that's freeing a lot of that capacity as well as opening up the site. And then long-term, the number of portables required on site would eventually diminish to 0. In this option, we'd be looking to move approximately 125 students from kindergarten to grade 7. And in this option, we're assuming that our current grade 7s as of this year that'd be transitioning to grade 8 would be given the option to remain at Ethel Gardner to graduate. Alternatively, we have Silver Creek. In this case here, Silver Creek would increase its overall utilization to 85%. albeit we're not completely at 100%. As you'll note earlier when I was mentioning the way that we staff the school and some of the programs being special education that have a higher space need, we will probably require portables at Silver Creek between 1 to 2 over the long term, but we're well below that maximum capacity on the site. So let's give a little brief summary over option 2. So in this option, we're assuming that grades kindergarten to grade 7 students would be moving to Ethel Gardner. So those are students that are currently, would be moving from Ethel Gardner to Silver Creek in zones E and H, which account for about 125 students. We're going to see Ethel Gardner's enrollment decline over time, and immediately requiring far less portables on site, and then declining to not needing any. And Silver Creek will increase in overall utilization and probably need a portable or 2 over the long term. Overall, transportation remains relatively unchanged. Where we removed transportation from Ethel Gardner, we added on to Silver Creek. Now for our second shortlisted option, option number 5. In this one here, this is where we've divided Zone E into 2 areas, acknowledging some of the commentary we've received from both our bound review committee, as well as what was expressed by the community as it's through the communications to the board staff. We split Zone E into 2 smaller areas just to define more the new development area versus the more established neighborhood that's been there for a number of years. So in this scenario here, we would only be moving zones E1 over to Silver Creek, and then the remainder of the zones F, G, H, C, and D would remain at Ethel Gardner. Just to give a little bit of a zoom in here, the division line that we've established for Zone E is along the backyards of Roswell Crescent and Davis Crescent, and moving along on these lots here that front onto 10th line, which are designated for future development. So this area south would be redirected to Silver Creek, whereas Zone E2 would remain at Silver Creek. Part E1 would be, E2 would remain at Ethel Gardner. My apologies. In terms of the transported areas, very similar to option 2 here, we don't have any impact on the walking students. So again, the zone that we have here, designated zone E2, would be transported whether it went to Ethel Gardner or Silver Creek. So there's no impact there. And overall, we'd be reducing 1 to 2 buses at Ethel Gardner and increasing by up to 2 buses at Silver Creek. Enrollment projection wise, here a little bit less aggressive in terms of how many students we're removing from Ethel Gardner. We go from 8 portables down to 5 on the first year, and then eventually we decline to 1 portable over a 10-year period. So a little bit of a slower pace on removing that pressure. And in total, we're moving about 89 students from Ethel Gardner and directing them to Silver Creek. Alternatively, Silver Creek will increase its utilization to around 80% and above. Given that, we don't expect any portables on site over the long term. And if we were, it'd probably be 1, just depending on how staffing and the classroom organizations are laid out. So just another quick summary on option 5. So in this case here, we've split zone E into 2 zones, E1 and E2. E1 includes the newer area of the community, which we'd be sending to Silver Creek, and E2 includes the more mature residences, which we would leave at Ethel Gardner. Again, here we're assuming that current grade 7s this year that would be moving into grade 8 would remain at their school, namely Ethel Gardner. We're moving about 89 students. And over the next 10 years, Ethel Gardner's portable needs will decline a little bit slower, but will still eventually go down to 0 over that 10-year period. And Silver Creek will more than likely not require any portables, but will have a far better utilization, being just above 80%. And in terms of transportation, again, it's rather neutral. We're not really adding that much more transportation overall and not affecting our walk boundaries. So with that, those are the options that we want to present to the community this evening. And now we'll be moving into our Q&A session. So the format of this is we'll have our team members provide us with questions that were asked before the meeting. What we've done in this scenario is we've compiled all the very similar questions together so that we'll just be answering them as one. However, I will still encourage you that you have the opportunity to submit even more questions this evening if you have anything new to add, or if you have any new questions based on the information that was provided. And to do that, we have the QR code here that will link you directly to the form to submit your questions, or alternatively, you can still just go to the website for the South Georgetown Bound Review and click on the form there to submit any additional questions. So with that, I'll hand it over to Lorene, Michelle, and Mitch to provide us with our first questions for this evening.
Sorry, 1 second here. Just trying to get a bit organized. Okay, so the first question that was received that we probably should address immediately is that somebody did point out there was incorrect information on the feedback form in terms of, I believe there was a incorrect map indicated. That has been corrected, and that it will now be, has been updated on the webpage. So if there are, everything should be correct, but please, if anybody else notices any other incorrect information, please let us know. The second question was about process and the timing of the study. Now, Fred, would you like me just to read basically the basic question and then you'd go ahead and answer them, or what would you like to do?
Yeah, just read us the question, and then
Sure.
myself, Jen, or other members can join in. And
Sure. Second question is a combination of a number of similar questions that came up, was basically about the timing of the study. And basically the question was, why wasn't this review conducted prior to the new development being built to avoid students that are currently at Ethel Gardner moving from Ethel Gardner? And second part to the question is, why wasn't the new development already directed to Silver Creek? Whereas the view is basically that all this could have been avoided if it was done from the very beginning. Long-range projections have been known for years, and previous projections have been completed before. This issue should have been addressed long before the study that has occurred. So go ahead, Fred.
And that's an absolute fair statement. So one of the things that happened here is historically, when we were seeing new development yields in Georgetown, or namely, in Georgetown, South Georgetown, we didn't see the number of students increase as quickly as we had over the last year or two. So we certainly saw Ethel Gardner increase in population rather quickly over the last year. So that flagged us. That flagged it for us to say, okay, we need to do something. Unfortunately, when we were reviewing this last year in the spring, it's a little bit too late for us to start a bound review process at that time. We want to make sure that when we do begin a process, we're not doing it so late in the year that there's disruption and people don't necessarily know where they're going to be going for September. So it's just the reality of having a new trend within the area. Something else that was pointed out was, with regards to the special education programs that we have there, that is a growing program in the area. And given that the majority of our schools in Georgetown or in Halton Hills as a whole are JK to 5 schools, that presents a few challenges for us to redistribute our special education programs, which are 5 to 8, to those schools, because then you're essentially splitting up the program between multiple schools, both the junior and then the intermediate level at another facility. So that's why a lot of those are housed at Ethel Gardner and Silver Creek, and that has also increased the overall space needs at Ethel Gardner, which just further increased and escalated the space requirements of the school. So for those reasons, that's why this wasn't initiated earlier. Initially, we thought we had a lot more space at Ethel Gardner than we actually did. So now, with that in mind, we're definitely trying to get in as soon as possible before the community is too well established, but also taking on the opportunity to rebalance enrollments overall.
So the next general question, again, this was a number of people did ask very similar questions, was regarding basically the registration, student registration. Why are current Ethel Gardner students being impacted and being forced to switch schools? And why are not new registrations not being sent to schools with available space? And generally, the comment was the geography should not take precedence over keeping existing students in a stable environment.
So with regards to that, when we're doing something like this, if it's to the point where we don't necessarily have the time and we're about to reach maximum portable capacity, that's when we'd be looking at a redirection, which would be what's being discussed as part of that question, where we just simply redirect students to another facility. However, in this instance here, given that there's there was enough space at Ethel Gardner for at least this year, and the fact that eventually we did have to resolve the underutilization concerns we had at Silver Creek, there was an opportunity to go through the full process and involve the community so that we can establish a long-term boundary, so that we're not having overlapping boundaries and students that are living within the same neighborhood or same area going to different schools. So with this, we just want to be, effective and efficient, and provide a future boundary that'll be in place for the long term, and hopefully won't need to be reviewed for the foreseeable future. And that's what we expect in both of these options, is that this will provide stability for the neighbors, or for the neighborhoods, for a long time.
Next question. It's a little bit more specific. So a couple of the commenters have questioned specifically if I am impacted by the new boundaries and currently attend Ethel Gardner, do I need to switch schools, or does this new boundary only impact new registrations? And I guess a part B of that is, why is the board reviewing boundary changes rather than having registrations at Ethel Gardner closed to new registrations?
So with regards to the impacts, is if the ultimate boundary that's approved by the Board of Trustees is a zone that's being redirected to Silver Creek, depending on what grades we decide to allow to be out of boundary to graduate, the students that aren't given that will be transferred to the new school. So you will be impacted. You will be transferring to Silver Creek in this instance. There are, depending on each student has a different case. So if there are any special needs or anything of that nature, there's always the ability to ask for an out of transfer or an out of area request, and that'll be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. That said, students in the regional program, so for special education, that are currently attending Ethel Gardner Life Skills, those are not being reviewed or impacted in any way. Those are going to remain as is. That's not part of the scope of this bound review process. So it's strictly the English track program that we're reviewing at this point in time.
So moving on to, there's a couple of questions that came up about the status of Georgetown South number 3 school site. Generally, the question is, and I believe this was answered early on in the slides, is have you reviewed the possibilities that students would move potentially 2 times? And have we looked at how these kids would be impacted? I believe it was answered in terms of that over the next, we don't expect the school to be acquired within the near future. So right now, that is not the part of the consideration in terms of looking at Georgetown South number 3. Expansion of Georgetown South number 3, why is there no need for the 3rd school in Georgetown South, even though there are portables that are required in South Georgetown? Fred, did you want to elaborate on that part of the question?
Absolutely, yeah. So the reason right now is overall, when the Ministry of Education reviews business cases that are submitted by the board, what they do is they also review what space is available throughout the communities. So they'll look to typically a 5 to 10 kilometer radius of where the site is that you're looking to propose a new project, and they ask how much space is available. So when we review that as a planning department, what we see is that there's just a significant amount of space available, not only at Silver Creek, but in other elementary schools in the North Georgetown area. So because of that surplus space that we have and the ability for us to house these students in our existing facilities or bricks and mortar space, It's because of that we don't see a need at this moment for the Georgetown number 3 site. There's just enough empty space that we could accommodate our students, and because of that, there's not a very feasible business case that we can submit to the ministry. We just wouldn't be successful. That said, we do own the lands, and trends change, things change. I don't foresee us needing it within the next 10 years. I think, there will be a shift in focus on Vision Georgetown as that develops. But with all that said, if there ever is a time where, there is an increase in population, or there's more development, or there's more intensification, at least we have the site to address that concern once it comes up. So we'll be holding that for the near future, just as we review numbers and we review the status of the community.
Okay, thanks, Fred. The next set of questions, and we've lumped them into basically one large question. There are many questions regarding student support transition and mental health accommodation. I guess a lot of the families are asking what support is being offered to students that will be moving schools. Next general question is, was student mental health and the well-being students considered during the process? And there were several people that bring up the COVID. COVID was obviously a reality for everyone over the last 3 years. And there was concern about how this may be causing further disruptions on top of what has happened over the last 3 years in terms of disruptions in the classroom and students being separated from their friends. What kind of help and support will be to support these students that will be moving? And a next part of that will be that will there be extra support being given to these students that will be moving from Ethel Gardner to Silver Creek? I don't know if Fred can answer that, or I would invite maybe Jennifer to hopefully answer these questions as well.
Sure, I'll get started, and then Fred, if you want to add anything in, please feel free to do so. So if you recall from the very beginning of the slide, definitely student well-being and is one of the factors that was taken into consideration. So again, we're looking to minimize the number of students moving, but we're also looking to ensure that we address the pressures so that we don't have to, go out another move in the future. So it definitely has come up, and it has been a consideration and a conversation, but we do certainly appreciate that for anyone that is moving, regardless of how good a job we do, there's still going to be some students that have to move from one school to another. So we do appreciate and empathize that can be a concern. But I will tell you, having been a school principal for many years, we deal with student transitions on a regular annual basis as students come in and out, even during the year. Lots of children move schools across our province, and especially in a growing area like South Georgetown, we're going to see a number of families moving in sort of periodically. So you heard Jillian, one of the parent council members from Silver Creek, actually address this and say that, there's definitely transition events that their community will look to plan for those students and their families once we've made the decision. That's the nice thing about the timing here, is that we hope to bring this to board and have a final decision approved by the mid to end February. And so families will have time to become accustomed and acquainted with the new community over at Silver Creek. And I can assume that this will include things like team and community building events. I know that probably the team at Silver Creek will work with families who are transitioning and with the school staff in order to make sure that we're meeting the needs with regards to what those events might look like. There would also be opportunities for meetings from one school to another, whether it's a transition meeting to support students who maybe have some special education needs in a classroom, whether it's to just support the mental health and well-being of particular students. These meetings will really be a key piece to that smooth transition. And I know that both of the principals and all of the teachers at both schools, they're really close, and they're going to work together to make sure that that happens. There could be opportunities. Sometimes there's new staff coming, and sometimes some of those staff may be Ethel Gardner staff who look to transition potentially to the Silver Creek community. So there'd be some familiar faces there as well. That's a possibility. In addition, families can also reach out for additional support. And again, this is on an individual basis, of course, but we do have availability such as child and youth workers, social workers, and additional, counseling and special education support resource teachers at the schools that can help make that transition more smooth. Definitely looking at linkages with the school communities and maybe even some events that they do jointly, and really trying to reach out and engage those parents. And again, Jillian, you might be able to speak a little bit more about this, but I just know, in meeting Jillian and Tui from Silver Creek, I just get a sense that there's a real welcoming atmosphere there. And so I know that they'll do a great job. And then, as I mentioned, just in terms of wrapping up, really looking at that individual attention. So if there are particular school students and families where children may be struggling a little bit more or be a bit more anxious about the move and the transition, certainly there would be individual attention being available and provided to those students and their families. I hope that helps to answer. And Fred, please feel free to add anything. I see Jillian too.
Nothing to add on my side of things.
Thanks, Jennifer. We'll move on to the next set of questions. And the next set of questions, there were a number of questions asking about out-of-area transfers, which we call grandparenting or optional attendance questions. So the first question was, will out-of-transfer requests be granted for students that have been impacted by the boundary changes, i.e. students that will be moving from Ethel Gardner to Silver Creek, but would want to remain at Ethel Gardner for whatever reason? Freddie, if you want to answer that question.
I'll maybe start us off, and then I'll hand it over to Jen to maybe close out. So those that want to apply are more than you have the ability to apply for it. If there's any particular needs that your children have specifically that would warrant an out-of-catchment request, that's where we encourage you to make that submission. I'd say typically when we're reviewing our overall enrollments, school by school as a board, we do identify areas that may be closed out of area attendances. Just generally speaking, there's always extraneous situations that would warrant it. But because Ethel Gardner is definitely a school that's got a lot of accommodation pressures, and that we're undertaking this review in order to, address those pressures that are impacting the operations of the school, depending on the need that's reviewed on a case-by-case basis, it may not be approved. But again, we review each individual application separately. Jen?
Absolutely. And you're right. I work with schools in the south of Milton, and I certainly know a lot about out-of-area transfer. And like it was, like Fred just shared, the whole purpose of this boundary review Gardner. So Ethel Gardner will be closed to out-of-area transfer request at the conclusion of the boundary review. And as has already been, the grade 7 students, current grade 7s, will be given the option to remain for grade 8. And I believe, Fred, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the considerations that the committee can discuss is a potential, allowance for 6s. Current 6s to stay into 7. But I think for the majority of all other students, because of the way the boundary will shift, we're looking to take an entire cohort of students, like a neighborhood. I guess we should talk neighborhoods, And so you really, as much as it is a huge transition and it seems like a really big deal, I believe that the best case is for all of the students in that neighborhood to move as one rather than trying to stay back, because even though it may resolve an immediate concern, it's that year after when other children might trickle back and make a different decision. I think it's just nice if the whole community can say, you know what, this was the decision made, and we're going to make a fresh start. Just because I think that that's better. When we've talked a lot tonight, we've heard a lot about, you know, COVID and the mental health and well-being. And again, it really is about friendships and having your friends that are, you know, with you that live in your neighborhood, who you can, you know, play with on your street. Those are the people that you're going to want to be going to school with for sure. So I hope that helps to answer.
Thanks. I believe you answered probably the next question was basically asking about consideration of expanding the grandfathering request of potentially looking at beyond grade 7 and potentially looking at current grade 6s as a consideration. On top of that, there was also the question of siblings. For example, will younger siblings be able to stay with their older sibling if that older sibling is staying in Ethel Gardner because of grandfathering rules? I guess the quick answer is basically that younger siblings do have the option to stay with their older sibling if they are staying at Ethel Gardner until the older sibling actually graduates. And then they would be required to actually move to Silver Creek if they're within that new Silver Creek boundary.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in there. Yeah, it's certainly something that we can review as a part of the implementation options for this. Again, you know, depending on how and what we decide on the grade cohorts that may be granted optional attendance at Ethel Gardner, we're just gonna have to make sure that the numbers work out overall. So as part of the work we're going to be doing with our feedback review with our BRC members is reviewing that, seeing if that's something that's very important to the community, and if so, you know, how far and how much can we implement to. And the thing with siblings too, you know, depending on how far we go with that is, you know, if you've got the older sibling that's graduating after the first year, and then the younger sibling doesn't necessarily have the ability to go with the other kids in their community to the same school, that's oftentimes something that we're cognizant of and we want to be wary of. So I'd say that those are considerations that are going to be looked at as we further review the implementations of the ultimate boundary. So what kids are being grandparented or given optional attendance, and are we going to be moving ahead with siblings as well? So all questions we're going to be reviewing at the next boundary review committee meeting.
Thanks, Fred. The next question is regarding before and after school childcare. One of the questions was how does any kind of boundary change impact before and after school programs? And I think one of the specific questions was talking about the YMCA program. If there's any comments about any impacts on the before and after school care. Yeah, if anybody want to come in and answer that question.
Yeah, I'll jump into that one quickly. And in discussions with Superintendent Scott Podreberic and his team, something that was mentioned was that as soon as we know what the results of the boundary review are and where the boundaries are, as soon as we know that, that's something that we should relay to the before and after care providers, and just to let them know that there will be a shift in demand between the two facilities, so that way they have ample time in order to reorient and reassess what their needs are, and try to transfer some of that supply to the other school, just to make sure that for the most part those kids continue to have before and after care. But that's a separate process. So once we know what's happening, then we're going to let them know what the boundaries are, and then they'll start doing the work to try to provide as much of services to the community as possible.
Thanks, Fred. Okay, the next set of questions was basically talking about the development of the options. So I'll slowly go through them because there are many questions on development options, development of the actual zoning areas that were developed for each of the options. So the first set of questions was talking about the options and how most of the options seem to focus on moving specific zones, specifically like Zone E, and including streets like there's a street that was specifically mentioned like Brannigan Crescent that's contained in Zone E. And Zone E and these streets seem to be the farthest away from Silver Creek. Why is the basic question? Why are we, looks like we're focusing on zones like Zone E, which are the furthest away, that will be moving from Ethel Gardner to Silver Creek?
No, that's certainly a good and a fair question. So if you review some of the other options that we had looked at, we looked at north-south divisions, we looked at some east-west divisions, which didn't necessarily just look at the furthest zones, Zone E specifically, being moved to Silver Creek. And what we came up with, and at the end of the day, is why Zone E has been part of the conversation for the most part, is really around adhering to that concept of having a walkable boundary. And a lot of the zones that are further west, closer to the schools, those areas are actually walkable quite a bit. So they fall within the 1.6 kilometer walk distance. So those are neighborhood areas that we have students that are walking down to Ethel Gardner. And that because of the location of the crossing guards and the crossing of Mountain View, we would lose a lot of potential walkers if we were to direct them to Silver Creek, because of the fact we can't provide as good connectivity over to it. So it may seem like they're close, but given the physical barriers, it does present some challenges. So with zones E and H, those are two boundaries that in their entirety, they're transported areas. So they're not areas that are deemed as walkable over to those Silver Creek and Ethel Gardner. So because of that, the way we're looking at it, as if we're adhering to the criteria that we prioritize as being a walkable neighborhood, and at the same time to prioritizing the efficient use of transportation, those are the two zones that you see in option 2 and option 5. Zones E and Zone H that are already going to be transported, whether they go to Ethel Gardner or they go to Silver Creek. So that was part of the rationale as to why those are the ones that have made it to the short list this evening. So looking at all the criteria combined in terms of maximizing neighborhood walkability, balancing enrollment, and providing stable long-term boundaries, those are the zones that best assisted in doing that. Because even some of the other more established areas, if we're trying, for instance, doing a north-south divide, it still wasn't enough pressure taken off of Ethel Gardner, given how new Zone E is and how much growth is expected within that area. So ultimately, that's been the decision-making process for how we ended up here this evening.
Thanks, Fred. Next set of questions, again, development of options is specifically asking about the development of the zone areas. The question is, how are the zones developed? And specifically, and I do see that there have been many questions regarding Zone E and the development of Zone E. Specifically, they're looking at Davis Crescent and Watts Road. There is a very firm comment that they should have never been part of Zone E in the first place, in terms of zone, because these are streets that are more mature areas of South Georgetown and should not be placed with the newer development further south that's currently under construction as well. Fred, I don't know if you want to start off on that comment.
No, absolutely, and that's part of the learning process, and part of the iterative process with our committee is kind of teasing out some of those details. So, I guess the initial inception of these zones is that for the most part, what we're trying to do is create areas that are large enough where you have a large enough student cohort within them, so that if you're moving them, there's a sizable population that's moving with them to the new facility, so that they're not one or two students that are being removed. And also gives us better options as to how we can develop better options to rebalance enrollment overall. As you look at the zones, they look rather, jagged, and they kind of cross different areas. And what we're trying to do too is make division lines where we're using, higher order streets like collectors or arterials to divide some of these neighborhoods, or where we can't do that, we're using backyards, so we'll avoid having to, the sense of having neighbors going to two different schools or things like that. And that's how we've essentially divvied up these zones as kind of elements or building blocks on how we can create options. Zone E particularly, and why the inclusion of the more established neighborhood. That one was one that's, I think in hindsight, we certainly could have divided that into two zones on the onset, and that or have it combined with Zone H or what have you. But at that point in time, what we're looking at is that is still a large enough crescent and neighborhood area where there's a sizable population there that would also be large enough to move to another facility, and then that combined with E, it just provided a good amount of students overall. So that was the initial thought process there. And as I mentioned earlier, as we run through the process and we work with our school reps and our boundary review committee members, that was something that came up is like, there is a distinct separation between the two, and perhaps we should change them. So in one of our meetings, what we decided is, option 1, which was removed, which encompassed all of Zone E moving on its own. We removed that and said, essentially, we'd better off going with option 5, where we divided the zone and accept or, acknowledge that area should be separated. And then option 2, although the Zone E isn't necessarily divided, it is combined with Zone H. So then you have both an established neighborhood as well as a new and upcoming neighborhood going to a new facility with the combination of the two. So I hope that clarifies a little bit of our thought process as we're drawing these boundaries and defining these zones that we can work with in developing new boundary options.
So Fred, continuing on with that thought, there has been a couple of questions of how were options 2 and 5 being the final two options that have been presented in this public meeting. And the next part of that question is, are the other options off the table in terms of consideration moving forward, specifically options 1, 3, and 4? Can we comment on basically the process of actually how we got down to these two particular options being presented tonight?
So in terms of the process, it's certainly a collaborative process that we've gone through. So, as we went through our meetings, we presented the options as planning staff to our members, and then the parent representative had the opportunities to work through them and discuss the options amongst themselves and how those options were successful in meeting the criteria that we established as a group, as well how we were prioritizing. Again, it was walkability, stable long-term boundaries, balancing of enrollments, and try to minimize portables where possible. So as we were reviewing those options, we were seeing as which options were most successful in addressing those. Other considerations too were some of the feedback we had received from the community. So again, we received a number of emails from the dedicated email, which we used some of that commentary, which is where the division of zoning I believe came from, as well as our parent reps mentioning it. That's part of the process. And as we go through them, we start to find, okay, well, which options are most successful in meeting both the scope and the intent of the review, but also what criteria we've prioritized. The second part is like, are the other options off the table? There's certainly components of those options that might present themselves as part of our next meeting if there were some things that the community felt very strongly about. But again, we need to make sure that at the end of the day, are these options meeting the intent of the boundary review and addressing the pressures while also meeting the needs of that we identified as part of the criteria in weighing those. So it's not a definitive no, but I think as part of the process, we've already reached the conclusion that those options didn't meet the test we were looking to. But again, we'll see what the feedback tells us, and then we can advance the process further and see where it takes us.
Thanks, Fred. We'll move on to the next set of questions, which is basically about transportation impact and safety. One specific question I've asked, there will be an increase in number of students at Silver Creek with the outcome of this boundary study, and therefore increased number of vehicles and buses that will be coming to Silver Creek. How is safety being addressed at Silver Creek with this increased traffic?
I'll give this one a start, and then if our Andrew from our transportation area want to add in, but what I'll say is this is initially Silver Creek used to be full and used to have portables on site. I think up upwards of 10 or more. And at that time, that facility operated. So the site has been designed and conceived in such a way where it can accommodate that number of students as well as that traffic on site. So we have the bus loops, we have the parking, and we have the facilities on site in order to accommodate that traffic. Now, with that said, again, we encourage that where possible, parents continue to allow their children to walk to school as well as use busing when it's provided to them, so that we're minimizing the amount of drive to school. Like that's, unfortunately, we'll never be able to accommodate a full parking lot of all parents driving to school, for instance. So, it's definitely a balance, and, it's working with our school administration as well as the community to, underlie the importance of using active and safe modes of transportation, and reduce the reliance on the automobile where possible. But with that said, our principals are excellent in terms of assessing safety on our school sites, and if there are ever issues, they're quickly addressed or communicated to the community and the parents to advise them that there's issues so that we can work towards some solutions. Jen, Andrew, anything to add on that one? Or
yeah, just gonna add on what you said. The loading zone at Silver Creek is fairly well designed. So for the amount of busing we're talking about accommodating for both options of boundary changes, I don't foresee there being any concerns there. Like you said, the more people we have riding the buses, the less traffic issues we will have at the school. So we do want to encourage that. And that's pretty much it for the loading zone safety there. So.
Okay, continuing on with transportation issues. If Fred or Andrew can answer this, bell times have been brought up, a question about bell times. Has there been or will there be any discussion about changing bell times for Silver Creek to align closer with Ethel Gardner to accommodate those who have moved or for this boundary change? If anybody wants to start commenting on that, that'd be great.
I'll just start very quick. I just want to be clear, the bell time review isn't part of this process. That would be a separate process in its entirety, but certainly something I'll leave Andrew speak to.
Yeah, so because of the difference in bell times here, there will be a review initiated by either boundary decided here, because Silver Creek really doesn't have any large bus going to that school. So we're going to be looking at efficiencies in the area. We can't really do that at this point in time because, one, we don't know which option is chosen, so we don't know how many students we're dealing with. We're still accepting bell time reviews from schools in the area, so you can't really make the decision without gathering all our information. So it is something that will be reviewed at. Parents will have their opportunity to communicate their concerns or preferred options. Again, this is something that we review and propose to our board of directors. Doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a bell time change implemented, but it's certainly a possibility given the discrepancy in bell times at these schools.
And maybe just lastly, once that decision is made, or as that's going through the process, whatever the outcome is, that will be communicated to parent communities.
Great, thank you. So there's several more questions that have come through the feedback form over the last few minutes, and I will go through some of the questions that have not really been addressed yet through the previous few minutes of going through questions. So the next question was, again, it's another process question, and it's questioning the timing of this particular study. I guess basically the question is, why was the public informed of this boundary review process the day before the winter holidays? And that's basically that is the question that's being asked.
Yeah, in terms of timing, we just need to make sure that first we had it approved by the Board of Trustees, and we had to go through that process. It was initially brought forward for first review in November, and then for final approval in December. And then the communications went out, I think, either the week of or the week after. The timing was, for this year was a little bit more of a challenge with the municipal elections happening. And trustee elections as well. And, one of the challenges that presents too is that it pushes our timelines a little bit further in terms of the inaugural meetings. So we, historically, we've definitely done it in November or sooner in terms of approving these bound review processes, but we had to wait for the inaugural meeting to occur in the first board meeting in November. So then we had the two following meetings to present an update. It's an unfortunate piece of timing. With that said, too, and I just want to further encourage the community that's listening, is that the board does release its long-term accommodation plan on an annual basis. It's a document that provides a long-term perspective, and as well as many of the initiatives that we're planning to implement or go through approvals for. And this is certainly one of them that were identified as part of that long-term accommodation plan. So, that to say that, keep looking out for that document and look at what's happening in Halton Hills, and it'll be the best source of information for you to see of what the board is proposing and planning over the long term within the community, both of bound reviews, new schools, or any pressures it may be seeing. So, yeah.
Okay, so the next question is a development question. Have you considered the development impact on the school, particularly the recent proposal of building a 157 apartment unit building on the Norville United Church site? I could probably answer this one. Basically, yes, we did receive that application, and it was circulated to us the beginning of January. We have incorporated this particular development, this apartment unit, into the Silver Creek long-range projections. So in short, the development has been considered in the projections for these schools. I don't know if there's anything else to add for that, Fred.
Nope, that covers it. Did you mention that we updated our yields recently too?
No, I haven't mentioned that yet, no.
So we've also just recently updated our student yields as to what we expect from developments, especially high density developments. So we're very much aware, as Lorraine had pointed out, and it's certainly part of our considerations and our projections that we've presented both to the committee and this evening.
Next question. Again, it incorporates mental health, and Jennifer, I'm not too sure if you want to go through in terms of the accommodation of students, addressing mental health of students, of students that may be potentially moving from Ethel Gardner to Silver Creek, for those people that may have joined this conversation a little bit later in the presentation. If you want to go through some key points, that might be very helpful for the group.
Yes, thank you so much, because we have seen a couple of additional questions, and this is such an important topic. I really felt that we wanted to make sure we addressed it again. I can absolutely assure you that this is a concern. I get it. I know that children moving classes and children moving schools is a big deal, and we do know that sometimes it can lead to extra anxiety, etc. As that it's that sense of anticipation. So what we have learned through doing these, and also through class placement changes and kids moving into our school mid-year from completely different parts of the world, we've actually, become quite expert in our ability to support students' individual needs. So I want to start really just by giving a generic statement indicating that, we really do value the mental well-being of all of our students and staff in schools, and we will individualize the supports and increase the supports as needed, depending on what your family and your child needs. So again, just reiterating some of the things that I shared earlier with regards to what the school schools are going to do to try to minimize these things. There will be a series of transition events where children and families will be invited to Silver Creek to engage in some activities. Maybe there's a parent information evening. These are transition events that we would typically do when students move from one school to another. And I know in your area, it's all kindergarten to grade 8, which is a lovely model. But many other schools would have a kindergarten to grade 5, and then there's a transition. So principals and vice principals, as well as staff, are really equipped to support transitions. And I do want to reassure all families that that'll be a key priority that comes out of this boundary review. So team and community building events, meetings with administration, as well as the new teacher to smooth the transition. We did mention before that some teachers may move to the new school as well. That is often a possibility, and it is something that we would welcome and consider. And actually, one of the questions I think came in around how are we supporting the mental well-being of the staff at Silver Creek who are taking on extra students. And again, just to reassure everybody that in addition to extra students coming, it's also going to give Silver Creek new staff coming to the school, new staff who can run different extracurricular activities, who can engage the learners at the school. And so it's not like anyone's going to be having larger class sizes. That's still all standardized across the system. So I just wanted to try to address that concern. I can also suggest that, an example of an increased support would be either a child and youth worker or a social worker. These supports can be made available, as well as linkages with our school community and outside of our school community. So just again, in a nutshell, in terms of mental health and well-being, we really do encourage families to reach out, to talk with their current teacher, to talk with their current administrator, and get those meetings and those connections set up so that this transition is as smooth as possible. So I'll end it there and say, it is a definite priority for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next question is about the criteria, and specifically student experience criteria. How do you measure student experience? Is reducing the number of moves part of student experience?
Yeah, I think it's a two-part. So I'll start it, and I think Jen, I think we'll maybe throw in a little bit more again on the transition piece as we once it's implemented. But when we're looking at it, we certainly want to avoid having to displace a community more than once. Our administrative procedure usually says you want to avoid doing it every 5 years. In this scenario, I think we should be having the ability to do far beyond that. I'm hoping that once this change is implemented, we're not going to be looking at boundary reviews for the long term. Then there'll be other focuses in the new development area, but that's certainly one of them. We don't want to be in a situation, or we want to try to avoid situations where we're consistently moving students from school to school, disrupting them, and we acknowledge that this is a change, and it does impact the student experience. So it's certainly part of it, but I'm happy to see that these are options, 2 options at least, that I don't foresee there being a need for future reviews. Insofar as there's no major changes within the area. The other part about the student experience too is the size of the cohorts that we're moving as well. So it goes back to when we were defining these zones. Like, we want to make sure that whatever zones we're creating, there's at least a significant population of students within there, where there's peers that will also be moving with them. And we want to try to avoiding just small pockets of students that will go to another school, but it's not large enough for them to have friends or family or other classmates that will be going with them. So that's why also the development of our zones and how large they are and how many students, it's part of the consideration where, they're certainly they're not going to be the only one moving to the new school. So that's another piece of it too, is making sure cohorts are large enough.
Thanks, Fred. Continue with those thoughts. I do know that the out of transfer requests, or what we're calling optional attendance, is still a big concern for parents that would like to really stay at Ethel Gardner. I wonder if we can quickly talk about the process again about out of area transfer requests.
Sure. Yeah. No. You can. It's a form they have to fill out and you submit to the school administration. They're reviewed and by both the school admin and the superintendent of the area. So if you are looking for the forms, they can be found online. So if you Google them, HDSB out of area transfer, you'll be able to find the form there. But I'd like to pass it on to Jen just to add any additional context.
Yeah. And Fred, I think I want to circle back to what you said at the very beginning, that because we are doing this boundary review and we are looking to decrease pressure at Ethel Gardner will be considered a closed school. And so it is not open for out of area transfer requests. So although the form is available, if you do Google HDSB out of area transfer, it does explain the process, and it does talk about an open school and a closed school. And if a school is closed, the principals will need to, according to our admin procedure, deny requests because requests would really defeat the purpose of the actual move. So I want to be clear that although there is a process, it's not going to solve the issue. And that's what we're trying to do here, is solve the issue. And again, we've talked a little bit about the option for grade 7 students. And we definitely will, have those options available. But I just want to I don't want people to think, oh, all I have to do is apply for an out of area transfer, because that's really sending a boundary review is going to result, Fred, and correct me if I'm wrong, in a shift. And we're not going to be in a position to offer options as readily as we could if a school were to be an open school.
Being aware of the time, there is probably one last question that would ask. Actually, there's two, but I think the one about the meeting number 4, in terms of people potentially joining, that could be explained at the very end when we talk about the next steps. So the last question that I'll ask is, again, back to the development of the options. The difference between options 2 and 5, the two options that were presented tonight, does the number of students that are moving justify which options preferred? We're looking at the difference between number 2 and number 5, the option number 2, number 5. What is, if the question can be asked, what's the justification between, or the preference between the two options that have been presented tonight, if there is any?
No, it's a fair question, and I'll say this. It goes back to when I was describing the criteria that we have. It's every option is going to be different, and every option will have different. Will perform better in adhering to some of those criteria more than others. So, I'd say that when you're looking at options 2 and 5 in contrast, option 2 is a more aggressive relocation of students, and then that way we're certainly reducing a lot of the pressures that are felt at Ethel Gardner. And some of the issues that they're having with space. But it also has a greater number of students that are impacted because of that. So you're weighing the benefits and the impacts to both. Whereas, option 2, although it helps over the long term, it doesn't necessarily help as quickly in terms of reducing the pressures at Ethel Gardner as quickly as it could have. But on the same token, you're not impacting a community that's more established in an area. That's historically been going to Ethel Gardner for a number of years. So, there's a lessened student impact there. So when you're looking at both options, the sum of their parts, they're pretty comparable. It just, at the end of the day, it comes down to, what are the criteria that the boundary review committee will put higher value to, and also have consideration on the longevity of the options, like what are some of the risks if things change. So those are all part of the considerations, where it's not just a simple saying, well, this one's moving the most number and more effective. Well, what are the other, how is it impacting the other criteria as well? So it's a balancing act of all those pieces and trying to come out at the end with the best potential options. So I guess, Lorraine, to your point, I think we're running near the end of the presentation here, and I'm just cognizant of time and respectful of people's time as well this evening. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just finalize the next steps of the meeting. What I will say, if you have any other additional questions, speaking to the community here, again, submit them through our feedback portal that we'll discuss in a second, or through the dedicated webpage. So part 3, next steps. So again, we want to hear what you have to say. So the next steps here is we do have the feedback portal that's been open since last Friday, and it'll be continued to be open till the 30th of will be open till this Friday, the 27th. So the purpose of this is to provide your insights on what you think of both options. This is your opportunity to weigh, how each, or what the importance of each criteria are to you, as well as how those criteria are met for the 2 options, and a little bit of information about yourself, so we understand what school, what program, and everything else you're coming from. So I certainly encourage you to fill out the feedback form and submit it. This information will be collated by us and then provided to the Boundary Review Committee, and this will help them reach a consensus on what options we want to bring forward to the Boundary Review Steering Committee for then consideration by the director and then by the Board of Trustees. So again, by all means, please submit your feedback. It's on the main webpage for the South Georgetown Boundary Review. As I alluded to earlier, the next meeting that we'll have, this will be open to the public. So if you are interested, please let us know through the central email, and you can request to be an observer at the next meeting. And just to be clear, an observer is there. They can be present, they can observe the meeting, but there will be no participation or no Q&A like we had tonight. It'll just be there so you can watch the proceedings. The next meeting will be where we'll present this feedback, and we'll work together with our Boundary Review Committee to select the option that we want to present to our Boundary Review Steering Committee. And as I mentioned earlier, prematurely, then we'll provide that to the Director of Education to then present to the Board of Trustees for consideration and approval. If you are interested, you may delegate to the board. You'll have 2 opportunities to do so. One on February 15th, when we first present the recommended option to the Board of Trustees, or March 1st, which is when the final decision will be made on the boundary review process. So for that, you can review our delegation procedure, which, if again you go on the South Georgetown Boundary Review webpage, you'll have access to this presentation as well as the link to that procedure. Just to close off, we're going to have our next Boundary Review Committee meeting on January 30th, and then we'll be notifying the community on the week of February 6th of what option was selected by the senior team and the Director of Education, and the option that will be presented to the Board of Trustees for first review on February 15th and final approval on March 1st. And then once we've made a decision, then that decision will be circulated through our school messenger. So please stay tuned in the next couple of weeks. So with that, everyone, I do thank you for your attendance tonight and for joining us and for asking the questions that you've asked. There's certainly something that helped us move through the process, and will certainly contribute to the overall refinement and review of the 2 shortlisted options we have. And again, I encourage you, please submit your feedback so that we have a good idea of what the community feels and how we can best accommodate them. Thank you again, everyone.